All right. Welcome in, everybody, to the deep dive. We're diving into a period today that I think really, it kind of shook things up when it comes to, digital privacy and all that.
Right.
We're talking about the globals, surveillance disclosures, um, all those revelations that came out back in the 2010s.
Yeah, it was a big moment. We're going to be looking at, well, a lot of reports, a lot of leaked documents that really gave us a glimpse, at least allegedly,
Yeah.
into how all these intelligence agencies around the world were operating.
Right. And it wasn't just, one country or a small group, right? It was huge, like the scale of it. I mean, it involved tons of countries and potentially a really massive number of people whose information, may have been got up in it all.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to overstate the potential impact, and to really understand it, I think we got to kind of start at the beginning, back in 2013.
Right. 2013, that's when everything really broke open.
Yeah, June 2013. That's when these top secret documents started to, they started to come out. And what's really interesting is the person behind it, supposedly, right? They'd been working as a contractor for the NSA, the National Security Agency in the U.S.
And we're not just talking about U.S. documents here, right?
No, not at all. This was reportedly included stuff from the Five Eyes countries, that intelligence alliance: U.S., U.K., Canada, Australia, New Zealand.
For those who maybe aren't super familiar, the Five Eyes, it's a big deal when it comes to intelligence sharing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it wasn't just like one dump of information and then that was it, right? This went on for a while.
No, it went on throughout 2013. These documents were coming out kind of piecemeal through different news organizations, so it really kept the story going.
So that constant drip, drip, drip of revelations kept the public kind of engaged, kept the pressure on too, I imagine.
Absolutely. It kept it in the public consciousness.
So, okay, we've got these leaks, but what do they actually show? What were these surveillance practices that everyone was so worried about?
Right. Well, one of the biggest things was this idea of secret treaties between these UK, USA countries, the Five Eyes. It suggested they were coordinating a global surveillance effort.
Right. So it wasn't just, each country doing its own thing. They were actually working together on a really big scale.
Yeah, and if you think about it, these agreements, if they existed, they'd really lay the groundwork for monitoring communications all over the planet. And it wasn't just the Five Eyes either. Reports started coming out about cooperation with lots of other countries.
For example, I remember there were reports about the BND, the German intelligence service. Apparently, they were just handing over huge amounts of data, intercepted data, right to the NSA.
Yeah, if true, that suggests a pretty close level of collaboration, right? And another one that stands out is Sweden's FRA. Seems they were giving the NSA data from their cable networks. This went back to an agreement from 1954, so it's really long-standing.
Wow, 54. That predates the internet as we know it.
Exactly. Shows you how deep these partnerships go.
So the list of agencies involved, it just keeps growing. I mean, from Australia to the UK's GCHQ, Canada's CSE, Denmark, France, Germany again, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Switzerland, Singapore, even Israel.
And their involvement took different forms, There were reports that Israel was getting raw data from the NSA, like unfiltered data on U.S. citizens even. This really raises the question, what kind of safeguards were in place? Where was the oversight?
Yeah, it makes you wonder, right? How much information was being shared, who had access to it, and what were they doing with it?
Exactly.
One journalist who covered all this pretty extensively, he called it a global surveillance system that really ramped up after 9/11.
Yeah.
It was supposedly justified by secret interpretations of law, which, it basically allowed for the collection of phone records, internet records, location data, you name it.
Right. I mean, the scale of this is what really struck people. And of course, the justification was national security, which, is always a powerful argument. But the question was, were these measures really necessary? Were they proportionate to the threat?
Right. Where do you draw the line?
That's the question.
The documents also revealed a really tight relationship between the NSA and other U.S. agencies like the FBI and the CIA.
Yeah, it wasn't just the NSA operating in a silo, right? You had this interagency cooperation, which meant that different agencies could share information, resources, expertise. It really paints a picture of a very unified approach to intelligence gathering.
And here's where things get even more complicated, right? There were reports that the NSA was actually paying companies, like private companies, telecom companies, for their participation in these activities.
Yeah, that raises a lot of questions, doesn't it, about how much involvement private companies had in government surveillance and what kind of potential conflicts of interest might have existed.
Right. It really blurs the lines between government surveillance and the private sector, which, well, that's a whole other can of worms.
For sure.
So on top of these domestic collaborations, the NSA also allegedly had, uh, well, these secret relationships with international partners like the UK, France, and Germany. They were reportedly sharing intercepted data on each other's citizens.
Yeah, that's right. And that really became a major point of contention, these data sharing agreements, because it really raises the question of what impact this had on individual privacy in those countries.
So we've got this global network of surveillance, these secret agreements, but what were the actual tools and programs they were using? Is where we get into the, well, the code names, right?
Right, the code names. This is where it gets kind of spy novel-ish, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So names like PRISM and XKeyscore, those became pretty well known.
Yeah, those were the ones that really caught the public imagination. PRISM, that was supposedly direct access to the servers of some of the biggest internet companies.
And XKeyscore, that was more like a tool that allowed analysts to search through just massive databases of information.
Right. XKeyscore, the report suggested it could be used to access emails, chats, browsing history, often without a warrant.
Wow, that's a lot of power.
It is, and it really raised concerns about, checks and balances.
Yeah.
And then there was Boundless Informant, which was designed to track how much data was being analyzed. That alone gives you a sense of the scale.
Right. It wasn't just a little bit of data here and there. This was mass collection.
Exactly. And then you had programs like Tempora in the UK, tapping into undersea cables, M-Muscular, a joint operation involving Google's infrastructure.
It's almost hard to keep track of it all.
It is, it's a lot. Stateroom, Luster, Dishfire, Karma Police, MY Stick, which had a sub-program called Summeljet. I mean, each one of these programs had a specific function.
It wasn't just random. They were all designed to do something specific.
Yeah, so for example, Dishfire. They were reportedly collecting millions of text messages daily. Karma Police, creating these detailed profiles of users' browsing habits. And Mystic, with Sommeljet, that supposedly could record and store almost every cell phone conversation in certain countries.
That's mind-blowing, the idea that your phone conversations could just be recorded and stored like that.
It is. It's a huge invasion of privacy, if true.
And again, the collaboration, right? The international partners, they were key to a lot of these programs.
Absolutely. The reports indicated they were involved in operating these programs, even developing them. It shows how global this intelligence gathering effort had become.
So moving beyond those specific programs, the NSA was also reportedly trying to crack cell phone locations all over the world. They were tapping into the cables that mobile networks rely on, collecting billions of location records daily.
Yeah, that's right. And if that's true, then it means that your phone, wherever you go, it's potentially being tracked.
And it wasn't just about tapping cables, right? They were also using location data from apps, even advertising tracking files like those Google cookies that follow you around the web.
Yeah, so all that data that's generated just from your everyday online activity, it could potentially be used for surveillance.
And then there was ICE-Each,
Yeah.
which was described as this kind of Google-like search engine for metadata. It supposedly contained billions of records accessible to numerous U.S. government agencies.
So you're talking about a massive repository of information about who communicated with whom, when, for how long. Now, it's not necessarily the content of the communication, but just that information about the communication.
Right. It's like the metadata. It's like the envelope of a letter, not the letter itself.
Exactly.
So when all of this started coming out, it obviously had a huge impact. I mean, it really sparked a lot of outrage, a lot of concern. You had these anti-surveillance movements popping up like Restore the Fourth, Stop Watching Us.
Yeah, people were angry, they felt like their privacy had been violated, and they wanted answers. And that led to a real push for more transparency and accountability from these intelligence agencies.
Right. And it wasn't just protest and activism. There were also legal challenges, right? Groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, they took legal action to try and challenge the legality of these programs.
Yeah, those legal cases were really important. They aimed to test the limits of government power in the digital age, to say, hey, you can't just collect all this data without any oversight or justification.
And there was also a lot of focus on protecting the person who leaked all these documents, right? Human rights organizations really rallied around them.
Absolutely. The question of whether they were a traitor or a hero, that became a major point of debate. But for those human rights organizations, it was really important to ensure their safety and that they were treated fairly.
So it wasn't just, a theoretical debate about privacy. It had real-world consequences, too. There were reports that online shopping and banking activity actually declined because people were worried about their data being intercepted.
Yeah, that's a real sign that the public was taking these revelations seriously. They were changing their behavior online because they were concerned about their privacy.
So the political fallout was pretty huge, too. I mean, world leaders had to respond to this. President Obama at the time, he talked about the sensational nature of the disclosures.
Right, and that was kind of the tone from a lot of governments. They were trying to downplay the significance of it all, to say, look, this is just how intelligence gathering works.
The U.S. Attorney General at the time, they emphasized that the surveillance was focused on foreign individuals and that it required a valid foreign intelligence purpose.
Right, so that was a key part of their defense. They were trying to draw a distinction between surveillance of domestic communications and foreign intelligence gathering. But of course, the question was, how clear were those lines in practice?
And then you had the UK Prime Minister. He actually cautioned journalists, told them to be careful about what they were reporting on, because of the sensitivity of the matter.
Yeah, and that raised concerns about press freedom, right? About whether the government was trying to stifle reporting on these issues.
Meanwhile, Australia's Attorney General, he went so far as to call the disclosures the most serious setback for Western intelligence since the Second World War.
Wow, that's quite a statement. Really shows how seriously they were taking it.
And in Germany, Chancellor Merkel, she initially defended the intelligence agencies, but then later on, she expressed some pretty serious concerns, especially after reports came out that her own phone had been tapped.
Right. It really shows the personal impact this had on world leaders. And it also highlighted the hypocrisy of it all, right? These governments were condemning surveillance by other countries, but they were doing the same thing themselves.
Then he had the Danish prime minister. He actually praised American intelligence, said they'd help prevent terrorist attacks in Denmark.
Yeah, so you had this mix of reactions, right? Some leaders were condemning it, others were defending it. It really showed the different perspectives on this issue.
So with all this public pressure, several countries, including Germany, the U.S., the U.K., Canada, they announced reviews of their intelligence practices.
Right, they were trying to show that they were taking these concerns seriously, but a lot of people felt like those reviews didn't go far enough.
Right. There was a feeling that they were more about damage control than real reform.
Exactly.
And of course, the media reporting itself came under scrutiny too. Some people argued that it wasn't always responsible, that it could actually harm national security.
Right, there was a counter argument that said, look, by revealing all these secrets, you're actually making us less safe.
And then there was an argument that these disclosures actually emboldened authoritarian regimes, gave them an excuse to crack down on internet freedom in their own countries.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It shows how these revelations had unintended consequences on the global stage.
So beyond those, like the broader reactions, there were also a ton of specific instances and operations that came to light. I mean, there was the NSA spying on EU and UN diplomatic missions.
Yeah, that was a big one. It violated diplomatic norms and really damaged trust between countries.
Then there was the hacking of Chinese mobile phone companies and universities, the bugging of encrypted fax machines at an EU embassy, codenamed Dropmire.
Yeah, those are classic examples of cyber espionage, and it shows how far these agencies were willing to go to get information.
It also came out that the NSA could keep and use what they called inadvertently acquired domestic communications under certain conditions, which, well, that's pretty broad, right?
It is, and it raised concerns about what those conditions actually were and whether there were sufficient safeguards to prevent abuse.
Right. It's like, what exactly does inadvertently acquired even mean? And then there was Boundless Informant, which was this program that basically created a map of global electronic data collection. It showed different countries colored according to the level of surveillance they were under.
Yeah, that was a pretty stark visual representation of how widespread the surveillance was.
Australia and New Zealand, they were reportedly deeply involved in XKeyscore.
Right, and that shows how integrated the Five Eyes partners were in these activities.
It also came out that the NSA actually acknowledged that the German BND was trying to weaken Germany's privacy laws so they could share more information.
Yeah, so you have one intelligence agency trying to influence the domestic laws of another country to make it easier to collect data. That's pretty wild.
Yeah, it really raises questions about sovereignty and whether these agencies were operating with too much power.
For sure.
We also learned a lot more about how XKeyscore actually worked and how Microsoft had cooperated in providing access to user data.
Yeah, The role of tech companies in all of this became a major point of contention. People wanted to know how much their data was being shared and whether those companies were doing enough to protect their privacy.
The UK's GCHQ, they reportedly infiltrated major international fiber optic networks, giving them access to huge amounts of data.
Right, so they were basically tapping into the backbone of the internet.
In the US, they were allegedly running these top-secret surveillance programs right out of their embassies and consulates around the world under the code name Special Collection Service, or State Room.
Yeah, so they were using diplomatic missions for espionage, essentially.
It also came out that the NSA was monitoring the communications of world leaders, including the President of Brazil, the Presidents of Mexico, and Chancellor Merkel.
Yeah, so it wasn't just about terrorism or national security. They were spying on their own allies.
Right, it really undermined trust on the international stage.
Absolutely.
GCHQ, they were apparently worried about a damaging public debate about the scale of their surveillance.
Yeah, they knew that if people found out the full extent of what they were doing, there would be a huge backlash.
The NSA even reportedly tried to compromise the Tor network, which is designed to provide anonymity online.
Right, so they weren't just targeting individuals, they were also trying to undermine the tools that people were using to protect their privacy.
Then there was Operation Dreadnought, an eavesdropping effort against the Iranian leader.
Yeah, so that shows how these capabilities were also being used for more traditional intelligence gathering, targeting specific individuals of interest.
The Australian Signals Directorate, they reportedly tried to listen to the phone calls of the Indonesian president and other officials.
So again, it shows that this wasn't just a US or Five Eyes thing, it was happening all over the world.
The NSA was even storing and analyzing internet and email records of British citizens, even though the UK is a close ally.
Yeah, it really makes you question the level of trust between these intelligence partners.
We also learned about the NSA's different classes of accesses, like third-party liaison for data from international partners, large cable for tapping into major communication lines.
So it was a very organized and sophisticated system for categorizing and accessing all this data.
Australia reportedly offered to share bulk metadata with its Five Eyes partners, even if it included data on Australian citizens.
So it seems like the priority was on sharing information, even if it meant compromising the privacy of their own citizens.
We've talked about this a few times already, but it's worth emphasizing again. The NSA was tracking mobile phone locations globally, collecting billions of records every day.
Yeah, the scale of that is just mind-boggling.
And they were using location data and advertising tracking, like those Google cookies, for surveillance.
Right, so all the data that companies collect about you, it's potentially being used for intelligence gathering.
Norway's intelligence service was reportedly cooperating with the NSA on targets in Russia.
So these alliances weren't just about sharing information, they were also about working together to achieve specific intelligence objectives.
The NSA even had surveillance posts in Italy and was targeting the Italian embassy in Washington.
So even friendly countries weren't off limits.
And it went beyond traditional communications, too. Surveillance was reportedly happening in online games and virtual worlds.
Right, because those platforms could potentially be used by terrorists or criminals to communicate, so they wanted to monitor those spaces, too.
The NSA also reportedly cracked the A51 encryption that a lot of cell phones were using at the time.
Yeah, the ability to break encryption is a huge advantage for intelligence agencies, because it means they can access communications that were intended to be private.
There were legal challenges to the NSA's bulk data collection, but the rulings were actually conflicting. Some judges said it was probably unconstitutional, while others upheld it.
Yeah, so the legal landscape was really murky. There was no clear consensus on whether these practices were legal or not.
We also learned that the NSA and GCHQ were trying to collect data from smartphone apps, and the game Angry Birds was mentioned specifically as an example.
Yeah, so even those seemingly harmless apps that we use every day, they can be potential sources of data that can be exploited for surveillance.
GCHQ reportedly launched a cyber attack on the activist group Anonymous, using denial of service attacks to disrupt their activities.
So they weren't just monitoring online spaces, they were also willing to take offensive action against groups they deemed to be a threat.
And incredibly, there were reports of government agencies infiltrating online communities and engaging in false flag operations, trying to discredit their targets.
Yeah, that's really crossing a line. It's about manipulating online discourse and potentially harming people's reputations.
The NSA even reportedly tried to build a database of information on system administrators to gain access to the networks they managed.
So they were targeting the people who have the keys to the kingdom, essentially.
Espionage in Germany by both the NSA and GCHQ was apparently quite extensive, targeting internet firms and even Chancellor Merkel herself.
Yeah, Germany was a high priority target for a number of reasons, including its economic and political influence in Europe.
The NSA was also recording and archiving almost every cell phone conversation in the Bahamas.
So it gives you a sense of the scale of data collection that was possible in certain targeted countries.
Vodafone, the telecom company, revealed that there were secret wires that allowed governments to directly access their networks in some countries without needing warrants.
Yeah, that was a big deal because it showed how governments could bypass traditional legal safe modes to get access to communications data.
GCHQ was tapping into undersea fiber optic cables through a program codenamed Circuit.
Right, so they were basically intercepting huge amounts of internet traffic as it flowed around the world.
The NSA had a program called Rampart A, which involved third-party countries tapping fiber optic cables on their behalf.
So it was a truly global surveillance network.
They were even using images from communications for facial recognition programs.
Yeah, so they were connecting the surveillance of communications with biometric data.
GCHQ's Karma Police program was trying to profile the browsing habits of pretty much every internet user.
That's a massive data mining operation.
In 2016, it came out that the US and UK had spied on Israeli military drones and fighter jets.
So even close allies can be targets of surveillance if they have something that another country wants to know.
The Shadow Brokers leak in 2016 exposed some of the NSA's hacking tools.
Yeah, that was a major breach that potentially gave those tools to adversaries.
And WikiLeaks' Vault 7 revelations in 2017 show that the CIA had extensive hacking capabilities too.
So it wasn't just the NSA, it was the whole intelligence community that was involved in these activities.
And even in 2018 and 2019, there were still reports coming out about surveillance programs like Reaper and the monitoring of journalists and activists.
So it suggests that these practices continued even after the initial wave of disclosures.
So, looking back at all of this, the scale and complexity of it all, it's pretty overwhelming.
It is. It really changed our understanding of how surveillance works in the digital age.
The range of information they were collecting, the methods they were using, it's pretty remarkable.
And it really raises the question, where do we go from here? How do we balance national security with the right to privacy in this digital world?
That's the big question, and it's one that we all need to be thinking about. This is a conversation that's not going away.
Exactly. And I think the more we understand about these issues, the better equipped we'll be to have a meaningful debate about them and to hold our governments accountable.
So we encourage everyone to keep digging into this, to learn more about the reactions from different countries, the debates about surveillance reforms, because there's a lot to unpack here. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening.